History has seen many kings. Some died in battle, some were poisoned in palaces, some were executed in cold silence. But there is one king whose death was so strange, so quiet, so unbelievable, that people refused to accept it. They said, "He didn't die, he vanished. And one day, he will return." Because this wasn't just a king, this was a symbol, a force, a man so powerful that when his death was announced, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a lie. And the name of that king was Frederick Barbarossa, the red-bearded emperor, the man who ruled with iron discipline, who dreamed of restoring a mighty empire, who marched with tens of thousands of soldiers, not like a mere ruler, but like a storm moving across Europe. But then, in the year 1190, something happened. Something that turned a real emperor into a legend. A death so simple that it sounded impossible. A disappearance so strange that it created one of the most haunting myths in European history. Because Frederick Barbarossa did not fall in a glorious final battle. He did not die surrounded by enemies. He did not collapse on a throne. Instead, he died in a river. A river, just water. No swords, no arrows, no assassins. And yet, that river death created a question that survived for centuries. Did Barbarossa really drown, or did he escape? Because after his death, people began telling a story whispered in taverns, repeated in villages, carried through generations. They said, Barbarossa is not dead. He is sleeping, and he is not sleeping in a palace. He is sleeping inside a mountain. Yes, a mountain. And the strangest part, the legend says, Barbarossa sits at a stone table deep underground, his crown still on his head, his eyes closed, and his beard, his red beard, has grown so long that it wraps around the table. And he waits. He waits for the moment when Germany is in its darkest hour. And when that moment arrives, the mountain will open, the emperor will rise, and he will return to rebuild an empire that never truly died. Now you might be thinking, come on, this is a fairy tale. But here's what makes it terrifying. This legend wasn't told for 1 year, not for 10, but for hundreds of years, and millions of people believed it. Not because they were foolish, but because they were desperate. Because Barbarossa represented something that people didn't want to lose. Order, strength, unity, hope. And when he died, Germany didn't just lose a ruler. Germany lost a dream. And when people lose a dream, they do something strange. They rewrite reality. They refuse death. They turn kings into sleeping giants and myths into promises. But here's the problem. There's a detail in Barbarossa's death that historians still find unsettling. Something that makes the legend feel less like fantasy and more like unanswered truth. Because Frederick Barbarossa did not die in Europe. He died far away. During the Third Crusade, one of the most dangerous journeys a European army could make, he was leading tens of thousands of soldiers eastward through heat, hunger, disease, ambush, and endless miles of hostile land. He was old, but still powerful, still feared, still respected. And to his men, he didn't seem like someone who could simply disappear. And then came that day, a day written in history, but also lost inside mystery. Barbarossa approached a river in Anatolia. Some say he wanted to cross quickly. Some say he jumped into the water to cool himself. Some say his horse slipped. And some say someone wanted him dead. Because suddenly, the emperor was gone. The river swallowed him. And when they found him, it was too late. But even that part is unclear. Because accounts differ. Witnesses differ. The story changes depending on who tells it. And that's exactly where legends are born. Not in certainty, but in confusion, in contradictions, in missing details, in unanswered questions. And Barbarossa's death had all of those. So tonight, we are going to step into that river. We are going to follow his final journey. And we are going to ask the forbidden question: was Barbarossa's death an accident or a cover-up? And more importantly, Why did millions of people believe that the emperor never died? Why did they claim he was sleeping inside a mountain? And why did this legend become one of the most powerful political myths in European history? Because this is not just a story about a king. This is a story about what happens when an empire loses its strongest man and refuses to bury him. So let me ask you something. If the most powerful emperor in Europe suddenly disappeared in a river, would you believe it? Or would you also whisper the same words people whispered for centuries? He didn't die. He's waiting, and he will return. And now, let's go back. Back to the moment Barbarossa became more than a man. Back to the rise of the Red Beard. Back to the emperor who terrified kings and became immortal in legend. Because what happened next was darker than death. Frederick Barbarossa. Even his name sounds like a warning. Barbarossa, the Red Beard. But he wasn't a pirate. He wasn't a myth. He was something far more dangerous. A man who wanted to rebuild an empire. To understand who Barbarossa truly was, you have to imagine Europe in the 11th century, a continent divided into fragments. Dukes, counts, bishops, city-states, all fighting for land, gold, and pride. There was no Germany as we know it, no United Kingdom, no single crown that everyone obeyed. It was chaos. And in chaos, a strong ruler becomes more than a king. He becomes a dream. Frederick was born around 1122 into the powerful Hohenstaufen dynasty. From childhood, he learned one lesson that shaped his entire life. Power is not given. Power is taken. He was tall, charismatic, and known for a cold calmness. A man who could stand in front of nobles who were twice his age and make them feel small. In 1152, Frederick became King of Germany. But for him, that wasn't enough. Because Frederick didn't want to rule a kingdom. He wanted something bigger, something ancient, something sacred. He wanted to become Holy Roman Emperor, and that title meant only one thing. He believed he was chosen by history itself. Soon Frederick marched into Italy, because Italy was the heart of the imperial dream. The rich cities of the north, Milan, Verona, Lombardy, they were powerful, independent, and they refused to bow. So Barbarossa did what legends always do. He crushed them. He burned cities. He besieged walls. He broke rebellions again and again. And every time he returned, his reputation grew. Not as a ruler, but as an unstoppable force. Even the Pope feared him, because Barbarossa didn't accept that a religious leader should have more authority than an emperor. He believed the empire stood above the church. That one idea alone made him one of the most controversial men of the Middle Ages. And yet, despite the blood, the wars, the iron discipline, people admired him because he represented something rare: order, unity, strength. Barbarossa wasn't a man of soft speeches. He was the type of leader who solved problems the medieval way, with steel, with fire, with fear. But here is what made him truly dangerous. He wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for a vision of an empire united under one crown, a Europe shaped by one will. That's why nobles followed him. That's why knights respected him. That's why enemies hated him. He wasn't simply ruling. He was trying to rewrite the map of history. But power has a price. Years of war in Italy drained his strength. The Lombard League resisted him. The papacy resisted him. The cities resisted him. And at the famous Battle of Legnano in 1176, his forces were defeated. It was a blow. A rare moment where Barbarossa looked human. He later made peace, but he never stopped being the symbol of imperial ambition. By the time he grew older, Frederick Barbarossa was no longer just a man. He was a living legend. And legends do not accept quiet endings. That's why in his final years he joined the Third Crusade. Even as an old emperor, he marched eastward again, not because he needed glory, but because his entire life had been built on one idea: a ruler must move forward or he becomes forgotten. So Barbarossa marched, through heat, through hunger, through hostile lands. Thousands followed, and then history prepared its cruelest twist, because the man who survived countless wars did not fall under enemy swords. He did not die in a palace. He did not collapse on a throne. He reached a river and vanished. And that is where the legend begins. Frederick Barbarossa did not become a legend because he was perfect. He became a legend because people needed him to be. Because in the Middle Ages, a king was not just a ruler. A king was the answer to fear. And Barbarossa was the most dangerous kind of answer. He looked like order. He sounded like authority. He felt unstoppable. To understand why he turned into a myth, you have to understand the world he ruled. 12th century Germany was not one country. It was a broken puzzle. Dukes fought dukes. Cities fought nobles. Bishops fought kings. Everyone had their own army. Everyone had their own laws. Everyone wanted more land. So when Frederick Barbarossa rose, he became more than a king. He became a promise that the chaos could end, that the empire could be united again, that the crown could be feared again, that Europe could be controlled again. And people love promises, especially when their world feels like it's falling apart. But Barbarossa didn't build his legend with words. He built it with action. When nobles disobeyed, he punished them. When cities resisted, he returned with armies. When rivals mocked him, he crushed them. Not once, not twice, again and again. And every time he came back from Italy, his reputation grew. Because that's how medieval minds worked. They didn't remember small victories. They remembered power. They remembered fire. They remembered the sound of hooves shaking the earth. So Barbarossa began to look like something beyond human, a ruler who could not be stopped. Even the Pope challenged him. And even then, Frederick refused to bow. This was shocking for that era, because many believed the Pope was untouchable. But Barbarossa acted like a man chosen by destiny, like a man who had permission to rewrite the rules of Europe. That kind of confidence is terrifying. And when people fear you, they don't just respect you, they mythologize you. But here's the deeper reason Barbarossa became a legend. He represented unity. Germany was divided, and people hated division. So they created a story in their minds. If only Barbarossa could hold the empire together, everything would be stable. It wasn't political logic, it was emotional survival. Because when life is uncertain, people search for strong symbols. And Barbarossa was the strongest symbol of all. Now here comes the most important part. Legends are not born when kings are alive. Legends are born when kings disappear. And Barbarossa's ending was not heroic enough. Think about it. This man survived wars, sieges, rebellions, betrayals, and political storms. Then suddenly, he dies in a river. No final speech, no epic last battle, no dramatic assassination, just water, just silence. It felt wrong. It felt like the universe made a mistake. And when people face an ending that feels wrong, they reject it. They rewrite it. They turn history into something they can accept. Because if Barbarossa died like that, then what did power mean? What did greatness mean? What did all those wars mean? So people began to whisper, maybe he didn't drown. Maybe the body wasn't his. Maybe he escaped. And then the myth evolved. Not in one day, but slowly, like smoke filling a room. Because medieval Europe was full of sleeping kings, kings who were believed to return. Arthur in Britain, Sebastian in Portugal, and Barbarossa in Germany. It was a pattern, a cultural instinct. When the people lose their strongest leader, they turn him into a waiting savior. Not dead, just hidden, just asleep. So the Kyffhäuser legend was born. It said, Barbarossa sits beneath a mountain at a stone table. His beard grows longer and longer, wrapping around the table, and he waits for Germany's darkest hour. And then he will rise. Now modern people laugh at this. But in those centuries, this legend was more powerful than armies because it gave people a weapon, hope. It gave them the feeling that the empire was not finished, that history was not over, and that one day the crown would return. That's why Barbarossa became immortal. Not because he conquered cities, not because he wore a crown, but because he became a symbol that people could not bury. He became the idea that Germany could be won, that chaos could be defeated, that a single emperor could control destiny. So ask yourself, what is stronger, a king who dies or a king who returns? Because when Barbarossa drowned, Germany lost a ruler, but gained something far more dangerous, a legend. And legends don't die. They wait. Barbarossa was old, not weak, but old enough to understand one brutal truth. An emperor does not get a second youth. By the late 1180s, his hair had gray in it. His face carried the weight of decades. Wars, betrayals, politics, blood. And yet, when Europe heard the news that Jerusalem had fallen and the Third Crusade was being called, Frederick Barbarossa did something unexpected. He stood up, not as a retired king, not as a tired old man, but as an emperor who refused to end quietly. Because Barbarossa believed something deeply. A ruler who stops moving becomes forgotten. So he gathered his army, not a small force, a massive one. Knights, foot soldiers, priests, banners, horses, supply wagons, thousands upon thousands, marching behind one man. And as they moved east, it didn't feel like a pilgrimage. It felt like an invasion. But the road was not heroic, it was dark. The deeper the army moved into foreign lands, the more the world seemed to turn against them. Heat destroyed the men, dust filled their lungs, water became poison, disease followed the camp like a shadow. Every day they lost soldiers, not in battle, but in silence. And then came the hardest enemy, distance. The crusade was not just war, it was exhaustion. And as the army crossed Anatolia, hostile forces watched them. Ambushes, raids, harassment from the hills. A crusader army was a moving target. Slow, heavy, vulnerable. And yet, Barbarossa kept going because he knew that the crusade was not only about religion, it was about legacy. If he succeeded, his name would become eternal. If he failed, history would swallow him. So he marched forward, day after day, even when the men collapsed from thirst, even when horses died on the road, even when the sun burned their skin like fire. The emperor stayed at the front, and his soldiers whispered, "If he can endure, then we must endure." But the further they went, the more the journey began to feel cursed. And finally, in the year 1190, they reached a river, a simple river, not a battlefield, not a fortress, not an enemy army, just water. And yet, this river would become the darkest chapter of Barbarossa's story, because the next moment was not heroic, it was not expected, it was not glorious, it was silent, and it changed everything.